B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Thursday, November 16th, 2017. Following the exposure of Harvey Weinstein's sexual predatory behavior, we're seeing zero tolerance for sexual assault, which is certainly warranted, and for different types of sexual behavior. Some of it just bad judgment. And today I want to open the podcast with a little bit of thoughtful analysis. And I invite you to respond and tell me your thoughts about what I'm about to describe. And last night I attended an event. I was on a panel talking about our local election results from last week. And present were 3 candidates running for a local district attorney job that'll be opening up next year due to the incumbent's retirement. And so I asked 2 of those candidates for their thoughts about the zero-tolerance wave that is crossing America and whether this violates the constitutional right to due process and the presumption of innocence. And will this hysteria, much of it well-deserved, result in wrongful convictions and people losing their jobs, their reputations, and even in some cases going to prison or jail behind charges that are weak or unproven, and those that do not cross the line into criminal activity? So I want to start here with a report on the kind of sex crime that nobody can rationalize or justify in any way, shape, or form. And we go to Myanmar, the former Burma, where the persecution of Rohingya Muslims by the Buddhist majority has reached a really atrocious level. More than 500,000 people have been uprooted, forced to move into terrible refugee camps in neighboring Bangladesh. And today, Human Rights Watch has released a report saying that the raping of women and girls appears to be even more widespread and systematic than earlier suspected. They interviewed 52 Rohingya women and girls who had fled to Bangladesh, including 29 survivors of rape from 19 different villages in Myanmar's Rakhine state. And they found that Myanmar security forces, uniformed troops, had raped and sexually assaulted women and girls during major attacks on villages and in the weeks prior to these major attacks, and sometimes after repeated harassment. All but one of the rapes reported to Human Rights Watch were gang rapes involving 2 or more perpetrators. In 8 cases, women and girls reported being raped by 5 or more soldiers. Now, I don't think that any person with any kind of a moral compass could say, oh, this is okay. I think that any human being has got to be totally repulsed by this. And I mentioned the other day that LeAnn Tilden, who plays Secretary of State in the Trump reality show, actually went to Myanmar and lectured Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Prize-winning leader of the civilian side. She doesn't control the military, and there are issues there that I acknowledge. But she has remained silent and actually rationalized the attacks on Rohingyas based on a few who had resisted the advances of the military of Myanmar. So, black and white, right? Clear-cut case. Then we turn to Roy Moore, the Bible-thumping, 10 Commandments installing, twice dumped from the Supreme Court of the state of Alabama over his poor judgment and insistence on placing his Christian values ahead of the Constitution. We now have 9 women who've come forward with various accusations. The most serious, which comes from the original accuser, says that when she was 14, he attempted sexual assault on her. She was able to push back, and so he did not rape her, according to her account. The other cases involve women who felt that Roy Moore was creepy, and some of them were asked out. A few of them went on dates with him. One got a French kiss that she didn't ask for. And I find Roy Moore to be a utterly useless human being. I disagree with virtually everything he stands for, and I don't want to see him elected to the United States Senate. But does Roy Moore have constitutional rights? Should he be convicted of any of these issues in a criminal way before he is denounced and repudiated and shamed, and essentially he's lost control of his Senate race to these accusers and to the media maw that has developed from it? Now, I have to admit, in this case, I can rationalize it. I believe the women's claims, and I detest Roy Moore. So it's pretty easy to say, well, he is getting what's coming to him, even if these claims are 35 years old. Now, his efforts to deny and respond to these claims are laughable, comical, and they reinforce the perception that he is guilty. But I argue that Roy Moore has the same Fifth Amendment rights to due process that I do. And they are certainly not being honored here. He's not considered innocent until proven guilty. And the right-wing media echo chamber has been hard at work trying to distract people from the accusations against Roy Moore and the risk that this poses to the Senate majority. That's what they really care about. And they need Roy Moore or a Republican like him to pass the ugly and obscene tax bill that is circulating in Washington right now. And so we're playing What About? And the leading candidate for What About is Bill Clinton. And so when you hear Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh working this over, there is a moment where you have to say, well, yeah, Bill Clinton was a sexual harasser. And I'm not talking about Monica Lewinsky. That appears to be a consensual matter. But Paula Jones, Juanita Broderick, let's see who else is on the list here. Kathleen Willey. They went to some lengths to charge Bill Clinton with sexual assault. And in particular, Juanita Broderick claims she was raped by Bill Clinton. Paula Jones was subjected to a come-on from Bill Clinton where he was apparently showing his penis while they were in a hotel room. And I believe that Bill Clinton has skated on these issues, and that Hillary Clinton has never fully addressed them, and her supporters, her loyal supporters who describe themselves as feminists in many cases, didn't believe those accusers. They wrote it off as all political, the way many Republicans initially did with the claims against Roy Moore. And you might say, well, gosh, Clinton paid a price. He was impeached. He was embarrassed. It was more than 20 years ago, in some cases more than 30 years ago. But I ask you, what standard do we apply here? Does Bill Clinton deserve a presumption of innocence? He was able to push back on these and pay off Paula Jones without ever seeing the case go to trial. And in, many people's minds, this should just be dismissed. It's old news. But if we are demonizing Roy Moore for actions that he took when he was 30 years old, 40 years ago, I come back to my question: what is the standard and what is the role of the Constitution? And this morning I got in the car to come to the secret studio, flipped on Rush Limbaugh, and he's going wild and bonkers about Al Franken. And before I discuss this, let me tell you that I've met Al Franken a couple of times, and I don't particularly like him. I think that he was at the center of the failure of Air America, the liberal talk radio effort that I was peripherally involved with from 2005 until 2009. He wrote some funny books. He was a good comic on Saturday Night Live. But the 2 times I've been around him since he's become a senator, he was very aloof, not approachable, declined an interview with me in a very, what can I say, a safe environment for him. And so I don't have any need to protect Al Franken. But he has been accused by, and he has acknowledged that these events occurred, by a Los Angeles radio newswoman named LeAnn Tilden. And LeAnn Tilden is a pretty woman. She's got quite a figure. That figure has been featured on the covers of Maxim, Playboy, and other men's magazines. And she went on a USO tour with Al Franken in 2006. During the Iraq War, Franken was a regular on these USO tours. And she reports that in rehearsing for a skit that they were going to perform on stage for all of these high testosterone soldiers, mostly males, and the material was kind of crude. And in this skit that Al Franken wrote, it called for him to kiss LeAnn Tilden. And Tilden, I'm sorry, I changed her name to Tilden. Her name is Tilden. And she reports that in the rehearsal, she said, look, we don't really need to rehearse a kiss for, who cares? And he was insistent, saying he's a professional and you got to do this. And when he kissed her, LeAnn reports that he forced his tongue into her mouth and that she felt disgusted and violated. And I respect that that was her experience and that it sticks with her and it bothers her. Then, when they were on a C-130 transport flying back to the United States, LeAnn Tilden, who was still wearing a flak vest and a helmet, was asleep in a seat, and Al Franken staged what was intended to be a gag photograph of him placing his hands over her breasts. Now, you'll be able to see this photo. It's going to be in wide distribution, no doubt. And because she has a flak jacket on, and because of the angle that I look at the photo from, it doesn't appear that he actually squeezed her breasts. And this gets into semantics because she accuses him of groping her. And my impression, I wasn't there, she was asleep, so perhaps Franken and the photographer are the most likely witnesses for this. But it appears that he pretended to grope her breasts without actually doing so. And so I ask, what is the standard? This is certainly bad behavior by Al Franken. LeAnn Tilden describes their exchanges in ways that show that she felt used by him. She didn't like him. And I can understand that. But this is not the same as Bill Clinton accused of raping Juanita Broderick. This is not the same as Roy Moore accused of serially attempting to have relationships and encounters and hopefully sexual, from his point of view, hopefully sexual connections with underage women. And as this swirls around and we reach a point of zero tolerance, I become extremely uncomfortable. Because whether it's Jeremy Piven who says, no, I did not do what I'm accused of doing, or others who, have some explanation or some story to tell about the accusations that have been leveled, there is no due process. There is no presumption of innocence. There is no judgment by a jury of one's peers. There is no facing the accuser. And I predict that this can lead us to some serious complications. My next evidence here is two men who were freed from prison yesterday. One in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 65-year-old Wilbert Jones spent 50 years in a Louisiana prison, which is the worst you can find in the United States, for kidnapping and raping a nurse. He has always maintained his innocence. And finally, the Innocence Project from New Orleans was able to establish that the eyewitness testimony that convicted him almost 50 years ago was unreliable and was contradicted by descriptions of the assailant that the victim made after she picked him out of a lineup, saying that the man who actually raped her was taller and had a much rougher voice than the man who was nevertheless convicted. And in Chicago, Detective Ronaldo Guevara has been accused of framing more than 50 people for murder, and yesterday, Jose Maisonet, or Maisonet, I am not sure how he pronounces his name, he was released from prison in Illinois after serving 27 years for a double murder that he didn't commit. And we learn that Maisonet was a low-level drug dealer. He paid the detective, Guevara, $1,000 a month in protection payments. That's Chicago for you. And when he cut off those payments to the cop, 3 months later, he was indicted for a double murder. And even to this day, there are 5 police officers who are refusing to testify using their Fifth Amendment rights in this case of Maisonet. And the police maintain that he's guilty. They have deep regret and sadness for the victims. But his attorney, Maisonet's attorney, Jennifer Bonjean, says the cops feared prosecution for what they did, which was frame my client, aided by the complicity and the silence of other officers. Their refusal to testify, she added, is evidence that the division where Guevara and other officers worked is rotten to the core. Now, Maisonet is the 5th man in the last 2 years whose conviction has been overturned after allegations of Guevara's misconduct, and at least 51 people accuse the retired detective of actions like beating them into false confessions to tampering with witnesses. Now, at this point, I'm not suggesting that there are bad cops involved in any of these accusations of sexual harassment or sexual assault. My point is that there is no process. We are not protecting the rights of the accused. Inevitably, I believe someone will be wrongfully accused and wrongfully deprived of their livelihood, their reputation, or maybe their liberty. And we need to think about this before it goes too far. And I do believe that there is a whole well of legitimate accusations that women have about men who harassed them, men who violated their personal privacy, and yes, some men who committed sexual assault. But for me, it's very important to differentiate and to acknowledge that there are various levels of criminal behavior, and not just apply zero tolerance and consider every one of these individuals who's been accused as guilty as we think Harvey Weinstein is. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Natalie Reel, Ethan Knox, John Molitor, he's a heavy hitter, $20 a month. Thank you, John. And also Joe Clarici, who does more than he has to do. I appreciate their support. I want you to join them. Come on over to peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu button. When it pulls down, you click on Become a Subscriber, takes you to the sign-up page, and boom. You can pick a level of support that's comfortable for you. And we have a case here of the U.S. Senator from New Jersey, who I regard, like many other people, as a sleazy guy, Democrat Bob Menendez. He was on trial for bribery and for greasing a friend of his, Dr. Salomon Melgen, a wealthy eye doctor and a heavy donor to Menendez. They partied reportedly with underage girls in the Dominican Republic. That wasn't introduced in evidence at trial. That's something I know from other sources. But the jury was hung and the judge declared a mistrial after interviewing each of the jurors and even switching out one of the jurors with an alternate. And yet they could not come to a unanimous verdict. And while I believe that Bob Menendez is unfit to serve in the United States Senate, he deserves due process. He deserves his constitutional rights. And while I believe he deserves to be retried at this point, he must be considered not guilty because he has not been convicted of anything. I'm releasing a fresh in-depth interview for my subscribers today at peterbcollins.com featuring independent journalist Joe Lauria, whose recent very important commentary and news article identified that the twin pillars of the Russiagate narrative are companies that were paid by the Clinton campaign. CrowdStrike, which examined the server and concluded that Russia had hacked the DNC server. And Fusion GPS, the company that was hired by the Clinton campaign to dig up dirt on Donald Trump related to Russia. They hired Christopher Steele. And when Joe Lauria wrote that piece, he posted it at consortiumnews.com, one of his regular outlets, but he also put it up at the Huffington Post, which took it down less than 24 hours later. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Joe Lauria.
But it's not the first time. The last time we saw something like this was the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, where there was a complete hysterical groupthink that seized the media. And if you dared speak out, like Phil Donahue, of course, you got punished. And lifestyle and career is uppermost in most Americans' minds in professional class anyway, and in journalism. And you're not going to stick your neck out. This is the one profession where you need, above all, to stick your neck out. That's what you're supposed to be doing, verifying everything government says, not just taking handouts from them, as we know they do. And if you go against the grain right now, which is that Russia did all of these things they're claiming, you are really risking a lot. And I see too many instances now where people are afraid to speak out. And it seems to be getting worse and worse as viewed here from Egypt. I really don't know what's going on inside the U.S., and I'm kind of worried about going back there because I think I'm going to be involved in one argument after the other with people about this Russia story.
Well, you're very active. You're very active on Facebook, and you see the way, in particular, Hillary Clinton supporters attempt to intimidate and they attack people who don't hold their view. The demand for conformity on the left to buy into this theory is as ridiculous as Trump's demand of conformity by NFL players who choose to take a knee or otherwise express a point of view during the ritual performance of the national anthem.
Like I said, I can't stand either side. You're right; they're doing pretty much the same thing, and it's not good if there's no freedom of debate and if there's fear that prevents that. And I ran up against it with this story that says that the Democrats paid for the opposition research that's the basis of this whole Russiagate story, unverified opposition dirt, which is not an intelligence report. It's to throw wild charges against your opponent. And the consequence of that being this new McCarthyism and the dangers to the geopolitical situation between Russia and the United States. This is only exacerbating tensions, and it's not a good thing. And that I think the Russiagate story fits into a pre-existing narrative and interests of ruling interests in the U.S. to gain control over Russia and dominance and influence the way they had in the 1990s with Yeltsin.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Joe Lauria, available for subscribers today at peterbcollins.com and our usual outlets. And one of Lauria's usual outlets is Consortium News, and Robert Perry there writes today about how the Russiagate blame game has spread to Europe, where we're now seeing blame for the Brexit vote placed on Russian-linked sites, but more than 70% of the alleged tweets from these Russian-linked sites came after the Brexit referendum. And Perry muses about the $160 million that was budgeted in the Pentagon budget last year to study fake news and propaganda. What if that money were used to examine the role of Israel in impacting American elections? Well, I think that's quite legitimate, and I invite you to read Perry's piece. Also, in my conversation with Joe Lauria, we talk about Julian Assange and how his private messages to Don Trump Jr. were leaked. And I think this is a more serious problem than Joe Lauria does, but listen to the interview and you can see or hear for yourselves. Anyway, the Duran, which is a Moscow-based online publication, points out, and this article is not all credible to me, but they advance the theory that Twitter violated its own rules and regulations and gave up these conversations that were allegedly secure to Senator Dianne Feinstein because she wrote a strong letter to the president of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, demanding that messages from WikiLeaks be released. Now, I have just one portion of the letter reprinted in this article, but it does request all content of direct messages greater than 180 days old between each requested account, and it's WikiLeaks, Guccifer, Julian Assange. And this does raise questions about whether Twitter has been demagogued into becoming a tool of the U.S. government. And I want to recommend to you the commentary by Caitlin Johnstone, the fiery Australian writer who covers American politics with a jaundiced eye that I really appreciate. And I thank a listener only known as Steve who emailed me a link to this. But she said everyone should do what WikiLeaks did. She says, yes, WikiLeaks has an agenda. If it didn't, it wouldn't exist. She says, I have an agenda too, and if I didn't, I wouldn't write. Now, I'll tell you right now, if I had the ear of the U.S. president's son, I would most certainly use it to advance my agenda. Any casual glance of Assange's Twitter page makes it abundantly clear that he's a fiercely opinionated man with a very clear idea of where power structures exist in the world, and he spends much of his time openly, unapologetically trying to sabotage the interests of those power structures. Johnstone says, I can say exactly the same things about myself. It is clear that Assange is trying to attack the unelected power establishment, which has loosely centralized itself in the United States, and he's throwing every weapon at it that he has available to him. Later, she says, if, like me, you see WikiLeaks as an organization dedicated to gumming up the gears of America's unelected power establishment, then you'll have a hard time understanding why anyone's making a big deal about any of this. And a final quote, we should all be willing to do this. We should all get very clear that America's unelected power establishment is the enemy, and we should shamelessly attack it with any weapons we've got. Food for thought. She's, I think, a really incisive opinionator. Well, Donald Trump will claim victory here because China has announced it is sending a special envoy to North Korea. He is Song Tao, the head of China's ruling Communist Party's International Liaison Department, and he'll go to visit with peers in Pyongyang, perhaps even Kim Jong-un. But we're told that he's going to relay the great news about the 19th Party Congress that was recently concluded in Beijing. Now, certainly, he may be carrying secret diplomatic messages from Xi Jinping to Kim Jong-un, trying to persuade Kim to stand down on his missile and nuclear weapons programs. But we'll put aside Trump's spin and see what actually comes out of all this. And finally today, the House has passed its version of the big tax cut for corporations and the wealthy, promoted by the Republicans. The vote was pretty close, 227 to 205. 13 Republicans, including a gang from California and a large contingent from New York and New Jersey, states that will lose the deductibility of from the federal taxes of taxes we pay at the state and local level, like mortgage, property taxes, mortgage interest. These are all being either rolled back or eliminated in the Republican plan. And it's very clear that this is Robin Hood in reverse. They're taking from the poor and from working families. The personal income tax breaks expire over the course of 10 years, but the corporate tax breaks are permanent. And that speaks volumes about the true intention of this so-called tax reform. Thanks for joining me for my daily news and comment podcast. It's available free every dang day, and we post it on YouTube for your listening convenience. I remain your humble host, Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.